Okay, you're back in force. So today we are going to focus on revenue sources that we think can really be subnational. Yesterday we talked about revenue sources that are normally national, but would probably be revenue sharing in Myanmar. For reasons we described yesterday, things like income tax, value-added tax, excise taxes are better done at the national level, but if you understand a bit about them, you might be able to negotiate some type of revenue sharing arrangement in exchange for helping to raise the revenue. But today the focus is on what we talked about the first day in real devolution, giving you taxing authority that you can control at the subnational level. So we had many examples from Yangon in the first session. So now we're going to drill down, go deeper into two of the most promising revenue sources, property tax and user charges. And we will step back from Myanmar and look at how these taxes and fees are implemented in other countries around the world, high income and lower income. So just to be clear, because when you say property-related taxes, there are many different kinds. What we'll be talking about today for the rest of the session is the first type, which is an annual tax on the current value of your land and buildings. But there are two other types of property-related taxes that are often done at the subnational level that we won't talk about today. In many countries, if you transfer ownership of real estate, if you sell your house, for example, you might have a transfer tax or a stamp duty or some type of one-time charge only when you change ownership. In some countries, it's a special tax. In other countries, it's part of a sales tax or a value-added tax. We're not going to go into that tax. Another tax that you find in many countries when you sell property is a capital gains tax. So hopefully you bought your property at a low value and you sold it at a high value, and so you have some gain. In most countries, that's part of your income tax. That's just like buying and selling stocks. We will also not go into that. So some basic concepts about the property tax and then a lot of examples. Why is the property tax so important for subnational government? Around the world, it's the main source of local discretionary revenue. So this is money raised by local government to be used by local government. So when we talked about own source revenue, subnational taxes and fees, this is usually the biggest item around the world. This is revenue that you generate yourself, and you have complete control over how to use it. And if you look at total property tax in a country as a share of GDP, and you compare it with something like income tax or value-added tax, it will be much smaller in the national picture. But in your local budget, it could be half or three-quarters of all of your revenue. And there are really three basic variations of the property tax. The most common one around the world, including the United States, is a tax on the capital value of land and improvements, which means a tax on land and buildings based on what you would receive if you sold the property in a free market. A variation of that, which is used in Great Britain and many former British colonies, is a tax on the annual rental value. That includes Myanmar.
So နောက်တစ်မျိုးကကြတော့ကျွန်တော်တို့
The calculation is a little bit different, but the principle is the same. What is the value of your property if you sold it? In very few countries, they only tax the land. In a place like Jamaica, for example, in the Caribbean, but that's very rare. So that's the tax base. What value are you taxing? And the other thing you have to think about is how much do you take? So what is the tax rate? So it can be uniform, one rate for all properties for all uses. So residential, commercial, industrial, urban, rural, doesn't matter, one rate, versus having different rates, for example, for residential and commercial. The most common form in high-income countries is two rates, one for owner-occupied housing, your main house, and one for commercial and industrial. But even that can be complicated in an emerging economy because you have to classify property by residential and non-residential. And often you have maybe the shop on the first floor and you live on the second floor, residential, commercial, it gets a little complicated. So many countries like Indonesia just have one rate. The other question is, do you want to have a higher rate as the value goes up, like income tax, or have one rate regardless of the value of the property? For simplicity and transparency, almost all countries, whether high income or low income, have just flat one rate. And again, the main purpose of the property tax is to make sure you generate significant resources for local government. It's not a very good policy instrument to provide incentives to invest, for example.
Can you give?
Yeah, so for example, you might have a part of the country that's poor and investors don't want to go there, so you give them maybe a tax holiday, no property tax, so they invest. It's a very good objective. This is the wrong policy tool for two reasons. The first is normally the tax is too small and it doesn't really make a big difference in the investor's decision. The second reason is you're taking money away from local government that they need to provide good public services and infrastructure for the investors. And it's really not a good instrument to achieve social goals, for example, redistributing income by having a progressive rate structure like the income tax. That's usually much better done on the expenditure side where you can target expenditures to the people you're trying to help. And finally, it's not a very good instrument to try to recover capital costs of very big infrastructure projects, again, because it's too small. It's usually excellent for operating and maintenance costs, small investment. For a really big project, you need a grant, maybe from the central government, maybe debt, but it's not really the right instrument to try to recover capital investment costs. The next slide is going to look a little bit complicated. It's got a little math, but don't be afraid. But it lets you understand some of the basic relationships in the tax, and I'll give you a numeric example to go with this. So I said you're taxing the market value of your property. How much would you get if you sold it? So in this example, you have a house and land whose market value was $200,000. Okay, we'll continue to the next term. Sometimes you don't want to tax the entire market value of your property, but a part of it, because property values change over time, they go up and down, and also you cannot be exact. So many countries will tax a little bit less than full value just to be safe and for politics. And you'll see this in the Indonesia example. In this example, you're going to only tax 80% of the value rather than 100%. So the assessment ratio is 0.8 or 80%. And then that means that the value that you're actually going to tax is not 200,000, but 80% of that, or 160,000. Do you think taxpayers would like something like this instead of 100%? Maybe 80 or 70%. It's smart politically, but it's also smart technically because, as I said, you cannot get the exact value. Even if you use a computer-assisted appraisal model and you're trying very hard, you will always say that the tax department made it too high a value. So technically, this gives you a margin for error. Then you have the tax rate. And so in this example, the tax rate in the law, we talked about statutory rate or nominal rate. In this case, it's 1%. So the tax is your assessed value, $160,000, times your tax rate, 1%, or $1,600. So that's how much you must pay. But if you're the government leader, what you really want to know is what is the burden of the tax on your constituents, your people. So you might remember a long time ago, maybe 2 days ago, we did income tax. 1 day ago, yesterday maybe, we did income tax, and we talked about effective rate. What is the economic burden on the taxpayer? And the easiest way to calculate it and the easiest way to understand is the second way at the bottom. How much tax did you pay over the value before any adjustments like 80% or 70%? So if you take the tax, $1,600, the value at market before any adjustments, your effective tax rate is not 1%, but it's 0.8%. So these are just some basic numbers and relationships. Don't worry so much about the technical side. But if you're making policy, you really want to know who it affects and how much it affects them. And as a citizen, if you want to provide a check on the tax people, you might want to make the calculation yourself. But my understanding is, for example, in Yangon, you cannot make the calculation because you don't know the value of your property according to the tax people. You just get the tax bill. So everything you have to know about taxes is in one picture coming up. Just one picture. It could be any tax. We're going to use the property tax, but the same formula and relationships apply to all taxes. So your goal, tax revenue, is a product of your tax rate and your tax base. Just two variables. What are you going to tax, and how much are you going to tax?
So,
in the example we just gave, your tax base effectively was $160,000. Your tax rate was 1%. Your revenue was $1,600, I believe. And as we discussed earlier, your rate can be either one rate for every property or different by property use, and it could be either progressive or flat. So if you want to increase revenue by the rate, the main thing you can do is to increase the rate, but politically that's very difficult. It usually means you have to change the law. So if you're going to try to reform property tax in Myanmar, you're probably looking mostly at enlarging what you tax or increasing the value of what you tax. And so for the property tax, tax objects are number of properties. That's all it is, number of properties. So you can try to add more properties. For wealth, you can revalue the property to bring it closer to market value. We don't have the data to be sure, but my guess is one of the reasons that the property tax bills in Yangon are so small is that much of the high-value property is greatly undervalued. But the taxpayer doesn't have the information to determine this. So if you're increasing the value of what you tax, you can revalue it to market value or increase the assessment ratio, for example, from 80% to 90%. And if you have many different special cases for property that you don't tax, property for social use, property for religious use, property for government use, and so on, another way to increase the value of what you tax, just like income, is to remove special treatment for some of these. If this seems a bit technical, don't worry about it. I put it up here because when I give you examples from other countries, I will use some of these terms. So just a couple more slides about basic concepts, then we'll start looking at examples. So back to our three favorite questions: how do you evaluate a tax? Economic efficiency, social equity, and net revenue generation. Economists love the property tax because unlike income, it's very hard to legally avoid paying the tax. You can hide income. Can you hide your property? Do you have magic powers to make it invisible? Very easy to verify. Can you move it? Income can be moved out of the country. What about your house? Do you put it on a magic carpet to fly away? So in the short run, you really don't have much behavioral change. You can see the property, you can verify it, you can't move it, you can't hide it. So economically, quite efficient. And it also supports local fiscal autonomy because it gives local government money they control for their expenditure priorities. So what about fairness? The second question. It's kind of a substitute at the local level for an income tax in the sense that rich people have more higher value property. It's almost a wealth tax. If you have high income for several years, what do you do with the income? You invest in property. So there's some correlation between property value and ability to pay the tax. And some see the property tax is a little bit of a benefits tax. Normally big property, high value in good areas, and get more public services, so they should pay more. Even if the tax rate is flat, it's still seen as progressive because rich people pay more than poor people with the property tax. Even though you might have one flat rate, not progressive rate, for example, 1%, the rich will still pay more than the poor, so people think it's generally a progressive tax. And revenue, your primary objective, lots of money that's relatively stable. And remember, only two variables, tax rate, tax base. So for example, if property values go down, local government can increase the rate a little bit, so the revenue's the same. And if property values go up very quickly, you can reduce the rate a bit so that the burden isn't too high for the tax. And you have many enforcement mechanisms. In some countries, if you don't pay the property tax, and you get warning letter number 1, and warning letter number 2, and warning letter number 3, and then penalty number 1, and penalty number 2. Finally, at the end, they can take your house and sell it to cover the property tax, and then anything left you get to keep. In some countries, politically, it's very difficult to take people's property, even if the taxpayer is wrong, like taking somebody's home. So what they do instead is basically say, you cannot transfer the property until you pay your tax. And we heard from Yangon that they tie payment of the property tax to getting other types of licenses and permits. If you don't pay the tax, you don't get your building permit, for example. So everything looks good. Lots of money in a fair way with the minimum distortions. Looks perfect. But I'm an economist, so I'm going to give you the bad news. Same three questions: economic efficiency, social equity, and revenue. In the short run, you can't move your house, but if the rate goes too high and services do not improve, you can leave the area. You can move yourself, not your house. The problem with equity is sometimes you have a very expensive house. Maybe you inherited from your parents or your spouse, but you don't have the money to pay the tax. So we say that you're asset rich. On paper you are wealthy, but you are cash poor. Some countries have a process where you can file for an appeal. You agree with the valuation and tax, but you don't have the money to pay for it, so you appeal for relief. But the problem is, where do you draw the line between being too poor to pay and having enough money to pay? That's has a lot of uncertainty. But if you have, for example, a senior citizen, maybe her husband died, she's in this nice house on a fixed pension, you don't want to throw her into the street, do you? Throw her out? Yes? No? How many people think not a good idea to throw the old lady out? Only one? Okay. So what they do in the United States is they defer the tax until the property is transferred, usually on the death of the occupant, and then they take the back taxes with interest from the sale of the property. Another problem is if you're Yangon or Mandalay and you have lots of high-value property, this is great. If you're from a very poor rural area, you have nothing to tax. It could actually make inequality grow between regions in the country. So many countries, if they give local government the power to tax property, they also have a grant transfer program nationally to equalize between rich and poor areas to balance this. This is interesting. So in good governance and in good economics, we say have a broad tax base, which means more people and more property. So everybody should pay. That's the theory. But it's very, very expensive to administer the tax for low-value property. It's politically unpopular. So what most countries do is they have a relatively high minimum value before you have to pay the tax. They have a high tax threshold. We also say in theory about good governance, you want to be transparent, right? But sometimes transparency is not so great politically. In most countries, people pay property tax once or twice a year. So you pay a large amount at one time, so it's very visible. You see it. And that makes taxpayers very unhappy. So if you pay sales tax or value-added tax, you pay very often, but it's a little amount. So it's a little bit like a mosquito biting you. You know, you don't like it, but it's not so bad. The property tax is like this. So my guess is this perhaps is one of the reasons that the property tax in Yangon is less transparent. Third problem is even if you're very sophisticated, very qualified, there's still judgment in valuing property. It's still subjective. So as I said, most taxpayers think the government overvalues their property. But if you want to get a bank loan and use your property as security, do banks overvalue or undervalue your property? Over or under? Under. It's always too low, so you get a smaller loan. The government always says it's too high, so you pay more tax. The bank says it's too low, so you get a smaller loan. So there's some subjectivity here. So there's a very interesting story from the capital of Bolivia in Latin America, La Paz. Everybody protested valuations were too high, and they were filing tens of thousands of appeals on the valuation. So the city said, okay, we will accept your valuation, but we have the right to buy your property at that price.
Can you see?
So the government says 1,000. I say 100. The city said, fine, we will take 100, but we can buy your property at 100. The mayor was a graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School. And the last thing is one of the most difficult parts of the property tax. Even if the taxpayer is wrong, people don't like the idea that the government can take your property and throw you out. It just doesn't seem right. And people get very emotional. So this is why we talked about other enforcement mechanisms rather than just taking the property. So let me give you an example from the city of Cambridge, which is where Harvard University is located in Massachusetts. So Cambridge, in the Boston area, in the state of Massachusetts. And this gives you, well, there's a very valuable property in Cambridge called Harvard University. And then down the street is MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. This is some general information about Cambridge. It's a city of about 100,000 people. And it's a very diverse city ethnically, in terms of income levels and so on. It's quite a diverse community. So this is looking at the budget side, city expenditures. And it looks at it by function, by budget category, and then it looks at the revenue by source. So the budget is over $500 million, $500 million, routine budget for about 100,000 people. And you can see, if you look at budget, from the routine budget, about 2/3 is salaries and wages. In terms of what they spend it on, community maintenance and development, education, and public safety are the main areas. And for their operating budget, 72% comes from local taxes. So about 3/4, most of that is the property tax. And the other major source are charges for services, about 14%. And the third major source at 8% are intergovernmental transfers, but in this case from the state to local, not federal. So you can see the importance of the property tax for the city of Cambridge, and this is not unusual. They have another budget called the investment budget or the capital budget. It's much smaller. It's about $32 million. Most of the money is for investment in community maintenance and development. And most of the funding, at least half, comes from these two items, which are municipal bonds. So the big projects like building an elementary school or a high school or improving the wastewater system come from debt. And for small investment or rehabilitation, also the property tax, 16% of the investment budget. Just a little bit of the politics of the property tax in Cambridge. What you see at the top is the percentage of residential and commercial property. So residential homes are about 60%. Commercial is 40% in number of property, but in terms of revenue, 2/3 comes from commercial, 1/3 comes from residential, and this is because the tax rate for businesses is twice the tax rate for residential. It's very good politics. Households vote, and so you want to be very careful with the households, but they don't want to have it too high for the businesses because they want them to be competitive. So the property tax rate for residential property in Cambridge is about 1%, commercial is about 2%. I want to show you an example of distribution of property from Jamaica, but it's typical of lower income countries. So dark is the highest value property, middle value, low value. So 3/4 of the number of properties generate almost no revenue, maybe 2%. Less than 1% of the number of properties generate maybe 2/3 of the revenue. So politically and administratively, all of these small, low-value property, you really want to have below your taxable level. Middle class and high income, about 1/4 of the properties, will give you 98% of your revenue, so you want to focus on middle and high-value property. I'd like to spend the last 10 minutes or so talking more about Indonesia. I think this is the country that the experience from Indonesia can benefit Myanmar the most, much more in this case than China or Vietnam. So I'll give you the short version, but what they did, this was in the mid-1980s. So at the time, Indonesia was under President Suharto, which was essentially a unitary government with quasi-dictatorship leader. And they had many property-related taxes, but except for one, they cost more to collect than the revenue they generate. So politically, rather than saying we're introducing a new property tax, they said we are consolidating all of these things and getting rid of 6 taxes. This is something that clearly can be done in Myanmar. The second thing they did was reject the World Bank's advice and have a strategy that was never tried anywhere else in the world. When consultants come here, they almost tell you the first thing you need is a complete and accurate property tax roll, property tax list. Consultants that come here will almost always say that's the first step. We say it's a data-led strategy. Get the data first and then proceed. They will even provide foreign consulting firms to value the property for you. The problem is it takes a long time, very expensive, and you create a special interest group whose incentive is to never finish. At the same time, everybody's angry with you because people are going around measuring the house and taking pictures, and you're saying, get out of here, leave me alone. So you're losing political capital and time, and how much revenue do you get? Zero. And you might remember at the time, this was a central government tax that was co-administered with local government. I think I talked about it the first day. So Indonesia said, why don't we start with collection and enforcement rather than getting more and more information? They said, we already have a tax roll. It's not accurate, things are missing, but our tax rate, effective tax rate, was 0.1%, 1/10 of 1%. The tax rate was 1%. The assessment ratio was 20%. So 20% of 1% came to 0. Yeah, so it was effectively about 0.1%. Very low. So they said, we don't have to be so accurate. Why don't we show that we're serious by collecting what we already have, and over time we will improve the data. My apologies, so the nominal rate was 0.5%. So the rate was not 1%, it was 0.5%, and 1/5 of that, 20% of that. Don't worry, all you have to know is that the nominal rate was really low, 0.5%, and the effective rate was 0.1%, 1/10 of 1%. That's really, really low. Of course, for very high value property that was missing, for example, you go to downtown Jakarta, like Yangon, and you look at the list and it says vacant land, and you look up and there's a 30-story hotel, well, that they added, but they didn't worry about the little property.
ဆိုတော့ဒီနေရာမှာဟိုအင်ဂျင်တွေအားလုံးမပါဘူးဆိုပေမဲ့
And when they started to improve the data, they said there's a difference between a fiscal and legal cadastre. So for title information, for legal information, you have a legal cadastre that shows borders of your property and value. That's for ownership information. They didn't do that. They said, we'll make a rough sketch, and it will be just for tax purposes, and that's what they call their fiscal map or fiscal cadastre.
ဆိုတော့ဒီ
The foreign consultants, the Dutch consultants, had a formula to figure out the value that had 99 variables that nobody understood. The number one and most important determinant of value is location. We all know the good parts of town and the bad parts of town and the parts that flood and the parts that don't flood. So they can just have some categories and say this is high or middle or low value. Second variable is size. So some rough estimation of square meters. And the third is some indication of value. And it varied from region to region what people invested in. In some parts, they would have really nice floors. Another part, they might have nice roofs. Sometimes, at the time, they looked at the parabola, the dishes. But just some indication of quality, maybe by dirt, wood, marble floor, something like that, very simple. And if you remember the picture from Jamaica, they decided to focus on the high value urban property. Leave the small farmers alone, leave the urban poor alone, focus on urban high value. It reminds me of the philosophy of a very famous bank robber in Boston named Willie Sutton. And they said, why do you rob banks? So if you're tax people, you go where the money is. You don't rob, but you target where you get a high return. A big problem anywhere in the world is when you let tax officials handle money. You never want them to handle money anywhere. It seems like a lot of money goes missing along the way. So another innovation was allowing taxpayers to pay via the banking system. They started with just the state banks, and you could go to the nearest branch and pay at the bank. Banks did not do enforcement, they were just cashiers. They just handled the money and gave it to the government. Another interesting thing was having an experiment first, a pilot project, before spreading it around the country. I think in general, if you're going to do nationwide tax reform on something like property tax, don't start in the capital. There are too many powerful people who will kill your reform. So they started at a district next to Jakarta that was kind of typical of the country. It had residential, commercial, industrial, some rural, but you can go back and forth during the day to monitor the experiment. You're taxing the asset, the property. And why that is important is that many countries say we can't really do tax enforcement because we don't know the owners. And they said, you don't have to know the owners. And in fact, we don't want to know the owners in Jakarta because they're generals and ministers who really shouldn't have the property. So we don't want to know the owners. We just want the tax. And if it wasn't paid, they would take the property or threaten to take the property, and somebody paid. And that way you get rid of the problem of identifying powerful people you don't want to identify, but still getting your money. And since we're out of time, I'll just say two more things about this thing. It started in the mid-'80s. It is still successful today. That's the first point. Second point is it's now been entirely devolved to local government. No more co-administration. And I'd be happy to talk with you during lunch and breaks and so on in more detail, but I strongly encourage you to go see yourself. Go talk to the Indonesians, talk to people on the front line, and hear from them why they think it works and why they took this strategy. I think it's sometimes nice to talk to colleagues in another country rather than listening to somebody else. Like Myanmar, people are very nice, and they would love to host you. So let's take a break for lunch, and then we're coming back at what time?
1:30.
1:30. 1:30. So, like I said, I'm sorry to cut it short, but I'm not going to stop you from eating and resting. So see you after lunch. Thank
ကျွန်တော်
you.
အခုနေ့လည်စာနားအချိန်လေး